So, welcome everyone. In the next 45 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph is quite in my opinion, quite an interesting topic. And I'm not entirely sure about everyone in the audience here, but the Microsoft Graph is a little bit more related, let's say, to Microsoft 365, which is my background. I'm sorry. I know that's, I don't know who was in the social event yesterday, but when we went to the social event, we came by a haunted house. That's a bit like Microsoft 365. I'm sure you all agree. And that's my life. I have to live this. So it's, I'm a little bit the odd one out here at this conference. I do a lot of PowerShell, don't get me wrong, but I'm not this hardcore hybrid IT pro. I'm more of a Microsoft 365 person. So, but in the next 45 minutes, we'll talk about Microsoft Graph and why it could also be interesting for almost everyone. So let's try to. Also, my clicker also doesn't really want to work today. That's also typical. Let's do it like this. All right. So you've probably seen this slide already a few times in the last days, but nevertheless quite important. Without sponsors like these, conferences like these would also not be possible. So, right, let's try the clicker again. Yes, now it works. All right. So I'm Thomas Vochten. I'm from a small country called Belgium. It's not that far away. It's a 1-hour flight, more or less. I'm a technology evangelist, which is a mouthful. I realize that, but that basically means that I like talking about technology a lot. That's also why I'm an MVP, a Microsoft 365 MVP again, I'm sorry. Which also means I like talking about technology a lot and to make sure that people don't make the same expensive mistakes that I always make. And I try to prevent you from having the same problems. I'm also the president of the Belgian Information Worker User Group, which is also a mouthful. Sorry again. We do monthly meetings around Microsoft 365, of course. What did you expect? And we have a yearly conference called Collab Days Belgium, which, if you're into 365, you don't know, well, you're always welcome. And I work for Kronos, which is a big Belgian technology company. If you've got any questions afterwards, after this session, or something that you didn't ask today, feel free to reach out to me. I'm a fairly active Twitterer, so the best way probably to reach me is through Twitter. You can always send me an email. You can try to visit my blog. Well, it's up. You can go there. But it's more like an announcements platform than I'm not a really active blogger. In my free time, apart from drinking a lot of coffee, I got into playing the piano again a few years ago. That's really hard. It's not like riding a bike. It's quite interesting, and I'm a fairly active runner. All right. So on the agenda. Introduction to the Microsoft Graph. If you haven't heard about the Microsoft Graph yet, well, if you're in the audience, you probably already know a little bit about the Microsoft Graph, but nevertheless, we're going to do an introduction on what the Microsoft Graph can do for you, what kind of scenarios can it deliver to you, when you're working with the Microsoft Graph on your own workstation, or when you want to leverage the Microsoft Graph when you're doing automating stuff in the cloud, preferably. So that's the first topic. And then we cannot talk about Microsoft Graph without talking about authentication and authorization. A lot of the things that you've probably already seen in the conference also is authentication through an Azure AD application. It's basically next finishing your way to creating an application, but then it comes down to granting that application the right permissions. And for the Microsoft Graph, that's quite particular. So we really need to look at that also. And then last but not least, don't worry, I'm going to show you some PowerShell. So then we can see how we can interact with that Microsoft Graph through PowerShell itself. Right. First things first, introduction to the Microsoft Graph. Now, the big question is, why are we here? Why are we here? Why do I care? That's probably a good question. Microsoft Graph, if you would go to the Microsoft website, you would see that Microsoft Graph is primarily a developer topic. I'm by no means a developer. I know my way around Visual Studio Code, just enough to get by. I know some PowerShell, and I'm sure you all agree PowerShell is code too, but we don't consider, or I don't consider myself to be a real developer. If you go to the Microsoft website, Microsoft Graph is all about APIs and authentication scenarios and doing very interesting stuff through C# to all kinds of JavaScript, all kinds of languages. But is it also interesting for IT professionals? Well, yes, of course. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So it's much more than just a developer toolkit or a developer API. Because the Microsoft Graph grants us access to a lot of things within primarily Microsoft 365, but also beyond that, that would not traditionally be very simple to get to with the traditional commandlets or modules or whatever, or SDKs that you have at your disposal. These are just a few examples. For example, if you want to, well, it's not necessarily the best example, but if you want to read your user's email, you can do so through the Microsoft Graph. I'm not saying you should, but that's something typical. Or doing something with your user's OneDrives, for example, stuff like that. OneNote, SharePoint. Well, you can read the slide. Because it provides you access to content, actually, not just infrastructure, not just the whole plumbing around it. No, it provides you access to actual content. For example, many organizations, almost all organizations, probably use Microsoft Teams these days, and we all know you can create teams through a Teams interface. There are various third-party products that you can use to create new teams, but you can also create like a provisioning engine yourself using the Microsoft Graph if you would want that. And not just creating a team, but also adding a channel, or changing the permissions on the channel, or adding a tab or a bot, or whatever connection that you might have in use in your organization is possible through the Microsoft Graph. So it's quite powerful. It also gives you access to a lot of analytics that you normally only access through the Microsoft admin portals, one of the 25 admin portals that we have. So that's also something that the Graph can help you with. And it's also, of course, because it's primarily a developer tool, it's also extensible. So you can also do, but we won't go into those details today. What are some typical use cases? I already mentioned a few of those. I see the Microsoft Graph used for onboarding, for example. That's a very typical scenario. Someone starts at your company, you want to do a few things, not just provision infrastructure or a PC or a mailbox or maybe their OneDrive or grant them a license, but also other stuff. That's something you can do through the Microsoft Graph. Finding meeting times. I've seen people recreate find time solutions with the Microsoft Graph. Well, if it's related to the actual content of Microsoft 365 data primarily, then the Microsoft Graph is your thing. You can also use it to create your own monitoring engine if you want to connect to specific security alerts or events. Stuff I know that you can also do through Azure itself, but if you would want to use another solution, maybe tied more to the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, then the Graph is also a case. Recently, I worked on a scenario for a customer, and this was basically a scenario because users tend to share documents out of their OneDrive to other people in the company. We know OneDrive is an ad hoc sharing engine. If you just need to share something temporarily with your manager or with your colleague, OneDrive is a good location. But it's not really meant to be a structural way of sharing. So it's not meant to be a team share. But you can in OneDrive. You can share a folder in your OneDrive to all your colleagues and tell them, well, that's how we collaborate, and that's what we don't really want. The problem is when people leave the company, their OneDrive eventually gets deleted or deactivated or archived or whatever you want. Organizations, especially from an IT perspective, you don't always have access to the information on that OneDrive, not to read their personal documents, but many people, because they share documents with their colleagues in a structural way. Microsoft Graph can help you there to give those users a notification through email or an adaptive card in Microsoft Teams. You know, one of these little pop-up messages, the interactive ones. And it's something that you can do with the Microsoft Graph. Just an example. So the Microsoft Graph is an API. Don't run away. I know API sounds quite developer-y. But it is what it is. So it's a RESTful API, which means a lot of things, but basically means that you're using a URL, a resource, and some HTTP headers to give the graph a certain command, and you get data back, in a nutshell. That's probably, at this point, more than you even have to know. So it's standard-based, and there's a single endpoint, graph.microsoft.com, so don't block that URL in your firewall, otherwise your solution will not work. And whatever you do with the Microsoft Graph, if you tell it to do something, that can be asking for certain information or creating something, a new mailbox, for example, and I know there are other ways, but that's it always returns structured data, and of course it's everyone's favorite. That's going to be JSON. So beneath the covers, if you would, there are different toolings available. If you would look at what will happen, this is a simplified version of what will happen. You ask a certain, you use a HTTP verb, get. And you'll get a list of users, and then you get something, a JSON output like this. This is Aaron with all his, with the most important user data. That's the kind of data that you get back. If you would not use PowerShell, by the way. So if you're a developer working with a JavaScript, for example, or if you really want to use invoke REST method, well, this is what you would get back, and you can work with that. That's what we have to work with. Some typical operations, I'm not sure if that's readable in the back, but some typical, and there are many, I counted this morning, there are more than 7,000 different methods and whatever. So this is just a very, very, very tiny list. But just a few examples of what you could do. For example, get me the last user that modified a certain file, and then you would have to use this structure. And the structure itself of the URL, that's why it's a RESTful API, is always very structured, and it's relatively simple. I hate it when presenters say that something is simple. I know that. But this is really relatively simple. Get all the groups in my organization, for example, get my email, my personal email, or someone else's email. We'll get back to that later on. So a lot of possibilities. The good thing is that the Microsoft documentation on the Microsoft Graph is really, really good. So yeah, it surprised me too, but it's really good. Sorry for the Microsoft people in the room. That's why we, no, let's not go there. Okay. All right. So this is all fine, but I still have a few questions. This is still quite developer-y. I'm an IT pro. I'm not going to fiddle around with REST queries and modify the headers and deal with authentication and do that all manually. I don't want to do that. But like I said, you can go the manual way, invoke REST method, and then with the information that was provided on the previous slides, connect to the Microsoft Graph and do your thing. That's true. And if you've seen one of these examples, you might have asked yourself, well, I know you can create a new team through the Graph API, but if I'm using PowerShell, I know the Teams team, they have a module, they have something to interact and to create new teams. That's true, but that's I think it's the ambition or the vision for the Microsoft Graph is the one API to rule them all, as Microsoft says. So eventually, all these modules will probably go away and migrate to that one big Microsoft Graph module. So, but yes, you can use other PowerShell modules to do many of the things that you see in this demonstration today. And okay, but how do I actually use it? And the big question actually is, how do I get to know the Microsoft Graph? Because as I said, there are more than 7,000 commandlets, and there are even more possibilities in the Microsoft Graph than we have commandlets for, which is another problem. But because that's the big challenge for Microsoft is updating the Microsoft Graph SDK, as they call it for PowerShell, to keep that up to date with the capabilities of the Graph. Best way to get started is to have a look at the Graph Explorer. It's a website from Microsoft that you can use to get to know the graph, to get to know all the different possibilities. If you wonder, can I maybe get a list of all my to-do or my planner tasks? Well, yes, you can, and you can test that out in the Graph Explorer. The cool thing is that it's graphical. I'll show you it in a few seconds. That it abstracts away a lot of the complexity, so you can already get a feel of what the Microsoft Graph can do for you. Right. Let me quickly show you the Graph Explorer. I had to restart my PC, so let's see if I can still connect. Let's go there. Graph Explorer. Internet connection works. So, what are we looking at? So on the left-hand side, you've got these are a few default queries that you might try. For example, get me my profile, get me my photograph, get me my email. But if you look down there, you see that there are many other possibilities. You can interact with applications. You can, let me click one. You can get a list of all Azure AD applications, etc., etc. The blue ones are gets, so just give me information. There's also posts. To modify information or to create something, but the possibilities are endless. You see Microsoft To Do, OneDrive, OneNote, Outlook, and you can go on and on. Security, get my secure score for my tenant, for example, something you can also do here. That works. So by default, when you go to the Graph Explorer, you're in a demo tenant. So it's all configured for you. You don't have to provision anything. You can you're automatically logged in. We'll see that, and then you can just click Get My Profile. And with a little bit of luck, we have a 200, which means it's okay, and then you get some information. In this case, I'm my alter ego, Megan Bowen. And then you get the same JSON structure, same data structure that I showed you on the slide. This is a simple example. The graph is also quite good at storing non-text stuff. Get me my photo, for example. See that? It gives you an overview. It gives you an output of the actual photo. Well, you also we don't have time to dive into the Graph Explorer for like 20 minutes, unfortunately. But what you also can do is in the responses here, there are a few pre-configured outputs. So you can, of course, look at response headers, which is REST stuff. But there's also code snippets for many languages, and usually, but I'm not sure in this case, usually also with PowerShell. So this tells me how you can get that picture from C#, from JavaScript, and maybe even from, maybe even from PowerShell. Of course, these are simple queries. There are many more possibilities like filtering and stuff like that. But it will give you, and that's relatively new, the PowerShell integration. It will give you an overview of how that will work. You can also log in to the Graph Explorer, to your own tenant, and see and look at your real data or your own if you have your own demo tenant, you can do that. Get me my manager, something else you can do. Let's look at the response. You get the idea. So Diego here is my manager. So if you wanna get fancy, you can also change the request. So in the top level screen, you can also change the request, fiddle with authentication, etc. But I'll leave that to yourself to explore that in the Graph Explorer. So, but that's the best way to get started, without a doubt. All right. Then. There is an alternative, it's Postman. If there are developers in the room that work with these kind of APIs, they will already know Postman. Postman is more or less the same thing. It's a little bit more, let's say, powerful. You can do a few additional things that you can't do in the Graph Explorer. And the cool thing is that Microsoft has already brought out what is called a Postman collection. On the Microsoft website, you can use a set of pre-configured queries that work with Postman. So if you want to fiddle around with the Graph Explorer in Postman, that's the location to go to. And this is how Postman looks, more or less the same as the Graph Explorer, but a little bit different. But that's for yourself to explore also. All right, so it works in exactly the same way. There is a certain request. In this case, get me my personal user profile, and then you've got your output. All right. We need to talk about authentication and authorization. Because you can imagine if you have Microsoft PowerShell graph commandlets, that would be powerful enough to do everything in your organization. That's probably not what you want. So we have to find a way to pick and choose the specific permissions that we want. Because if you have an application, you don't want people to read mailboxes and access OneDrives and read security information, create new teams, whatever, something we don't want. So we need to really control those permissions in a granular way. Now, in the Microsoft Graph, there are two types of permissions. There are delegated permissions and let's say app permissions. For most of my scenarios, I use app permissions because if you're doing anything with automations, so an application, let's call it an application that doesn't interact with the user, the best way to go is to go for app permissions. If you want users to access specific data that is with a delegated permission, you can go that way, but it's then you're accessing the data with the user's identity. If you're using app permissions, you're accessing the data with the app's identity itself. But that will all get clear in a few seconds. So in order to use our PowerShell commandlets, and we will get to PowerShell in the end, don't worry, we need to create an application identity. You've probably already seen that a few times this week. It's basically, like I said, next, finishing your way through a wizard, and then you have an application registration in Azure Active Directory. So that's always the first step. Now we need to configure authentication, because how is this PowerShell commandlet going to connect to that identity or use that identity? And then we grant the necessary permissions for our application to the Microsoft Graph or to very specific methods inside of the Microsoft Graph. How do you configure the authentication? There are many different ways. You can always go for the interactive way, but for automation scenarios, that's probably not what you want. So that usual pop-up that the user can specify username and password or a device code or whatever, but with app permissions, that's not what we want. You can go, like everyone knows, with app ID is secret, so username and password basically. Also, everyone knows by now that's probably not the best idea to do so, because those kind of credentials will end up somewhere in source control or on a PC somewhere. We don't want that. There are different other ways. I'd like to use a certificate. That's also what I use in my presentation or in my demonstration. So I installed a certificate on my PC and I made that available to the Azure AD application, and that's how the authentication will work. But I'll show you that in a few minutes. So every operation in the Microsoft Graph requires specific permissions. I'll show you that in a demonstration. The list is endless. So you can go really granular. If all you have to do is create Microsoft Teams, for example, there is a specific permission to create Microsoft Teams. If that's all you want to do, by all means, just use that permissions. You can go wild, of course. You can give applications permissions to just create new channels and not create new teams, stuff like that. That can all be configured. In the beginning, it's a little bit fiddling around with all kinds of settings, and you're never sure what permissions, what permissions you need, because sometimes, documentation will tell you, but if you do something in PowerShell that requires another permission level, PowerShell will also tell you, fortunately. So that's good. Some of these permissions require administrator consent for the whole tenant. That's something that I'm also going to show you. So, all right, authentication and authorization. How does that work? We'll have to go to our AD, Azure Active Directory. I think I should probably have changed my resolution, but that's maybe a little bit too late to change that now. Azure Active Directory, app registrations, and then there is a button, new registration, and you can go with the defaults. You can give your application a name, and I ended up with the very creative name, Microsoft.graph.powershell. So that's the application that I created. So when we are going to use our PowerShell, we're going to specify this application ID so we can get a hold of the permissions that we need. That's how we tie everything together. With an application, there isn't just an identity, there is also a password or a secret. In this case, I'm using a certificate. So the way this works is you create a certificate, can be a self-signed certificate, doesn't really matter. You store that certificate with its private key on the location where you want to store, when you want to execute your script, in my case, on my PC, in my personal certificate store. Or if you want to go for Azure Automation or Azure Functions and run your PowerShell there, store the certificate with the public key over there, and then it will be available to you. I'm not going to show you how you upload and create a certificate. I'm sure you can find how that works. But that's how I'm doing the authentication part. And now let's look at the API permissions. That's on the left-hand side there, API permission, and that's where it gets interesting. So my application already has a few very specific permissions. In my demonstration later on, I'm going to work with Microsoft Teams, so I need information on permissions around Microsoft Teams. I'm going to do a few more things. So what I need to work with Teams is this one, teamwork.migrate.all. It's an application permission, and I've granted this permission access to the whole tenant with admin consent. I also have user read all, so I can get to all users in my tenant. I have a few other things. I can also read devices, for example, all the PCs that are hybrid joined or domain hybrid joined or joined to your tenant. You can get to those with those permissions. There is security events.read.all to read your secure score, to read security events, etc., etc. So those are the permissions that I've configured. If you want to add new permissions, you can go to Add Permission, click on I think it really wants you to click Microsoft Graph. There are other ones available, so Microsoft Graph, and we will go for application permissions. And then again, we have this very, 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 very long list of possible permissions. See, the possibilities are endless. If you're not really sure what you're looking at, you can always search, and then, oh yeah, my application has to add members or read members of a team. Then you click this permission. You can select multiple if you want. So be granular, that's the whole point. And then click all permissions, or add permissions, excuse me, and successfully saved permissions for my Microsoft Graph PowerShell. So my application will now have access to all the member information in all the teams. But you can see admin consent has not been granted, so you have to go there, grant admin consent for my tenant, yes, and then I can use it in my applications, and everyone can leverage this. So that is basically, in a nutshell, how the whole authentication through the ID and the certificate and the authorization through the API permissions works. If you do anything in PowerShell that requires a permission that you haven't listed here, it will tell you normally. So it will tell you, oh yeah, well, you need group read write all, for example, for this to work. And then you change the permission, you disconnect from the Microsoft Graph. Unfortunately, that's something you do, and then you connect again. Yes? Yeah, then you have to create different applications. So for every PowerShell script that has a certain responsibility, you create an application registration with a certain set of permissions. And if you have 25 PowerShell scripts that do 25 totally different things, you create 25 different applications with different settings.
Okay, so
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The name here, like I said, was not very creative. Microsoft Graph PowerShell, it is just for one application. So you can call it, I don't know, Teams provisioning engine or something, and then you know what, because if you call all your if you give all your applications a generic name, that will not really help, but that's the idea. Yeah. Yes?
You also manually control which teams, I assume, because now you're giving access to all teams.
Well, good question, actually. Good question. I don't think you can specify a specific team. No. But I might be incorrect, so if someone knows the answer, but I don't think it's normally general permissions. You can read all the teams, you can write in teams or both, but I don't think you can scope it to one specific team, but I might be mistaken. Yeah. Yes?
There was a workshop yesterday where he showed how to grant access to all SharePoint, and then you provide set the permissions in SharePoint.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess it's cheap.
Yeah, you can turn it around. Yes, yes, because your application has an identity, and you can work with that identity in the application that you're targeting. That's true. Yeah, that's possible, but not from the API permissions dialog. No, unfortunately not. But that would be a good. They're quite open to feedback, so we might even mention that to them. Yeah. Okay. Finally, some PowerShell. That's what you were all waiting for, right? Because I have 40 minutes left and we haven't really talked about PowerShell yet. So, Microsoft Graph API, very powerful, many capabilities, especially for developers. But what if you want to do it with PowerShell? The PowerShell SDK for the Graph API, for the Microsoft Graph, as it's officially called, abstracts away most of the complexity. That's a good thing. Also, from an authentication and authorization standpoint, the module you need is the Microsoft Graph. So, for this audience, I don't have to explain what install module means. So, you install the Microsoft Graph module. It's actually different modules that get installed at the same time. There are certain prerequisites, but I guess, again, people in this room will all have this, so that won't be a problem. That's what you need. You have to be a little bit careful, because if you install the Microsoft Graph module, you get actually, I don't know how many, but a few tens of modules, and it's like, I don't know, 1 gigabyte of content, 1 gigabyte of files. So be wary. For your developer workstation or your workstation itself, that won't necessarily be a problem. But you can imagine if you've worked with Azure Functions or Azure Automation, and if you just do install module Microsoft Graph, your function will wait for, I don't know, 60 seconds. And if you're going for an app plan that gets restarted started every time upon request, that will not be good for performance. Luckily, there is a trick. I'll show you that in a demonstration, because of course that bit me the first time I used it in I think it was Azure Functions. There is a possibility to call the very specific Microsoft Graph modules that you need. If you want to do something with Teams, you will use Microsoft.graph.teams, and you use that module, not just do Microsoft Graph in its entirety. But that's something you learn by doing, or by learning from your mistakes. The Microsoft Graph API has a production version and a beta version. Of course, beta is beta and comes with all the positive and negative things that you might expect. I often still go for the beta endpoint. The main downside is that some things might change, so depending on what you want to do. But if you want to go for the beta endpoint, you do that through that commandlet, select mg profile, name beta. All the Microsoft Graph commandlets have mg in as a prefix. So I know, well, there's lots of things to say about many PowerShell commandlets or modules put out by Microsoft, but the Microsoft Graph ones actually are quite consistent, so you might be surprised. All right, how do we connect to the Microsoft Graph? With connect mg graph, and then we can specify specific permissions that we want, like this. User read all or a group read write all. That's something you can do, or you can configure that through the application as we've seen before, and that's usually the way how I do it. Yeah, I think we more or less talked about this. There is quite a consistent prefix, and we've seen in the Graph Explorer that there are different methods in HTTP, and they all relate to a specific verb in PowerShell. So get mg, new mg. Put is also new, patch is update, and delete is always remove. So if you're looking at the Graph documentation and you're looking for a certain PowerShell commandlet, that's usually the convention they use. So it's relatively straightforward. Again, get mg user will get you a list of users. New mg team will create a team. Update mg team channel will update a channel in a team with some information, some property, and remove mg group will remove a group. Again, you might ask yourself, yeah, well, getting a list of users or removing a group, I can do that through other means and other PowerShell commandlets. Well, of course, but if you're basing your application on the Microsoft Graph and you're passing you're passing stuff from one command to another, this is quite good for consistency, and then it will actually work. So this is basically how the consent dialog box looks like. For application permissions, you will not see this very often, but for user permissions, you might see this sometimes. All right. Okay, so this is the user dialog box that you hopefully don't see that much. A better alternative, like I said, is do something else, use a client ID or secret, but better use a certificate. And then use the same commandlet, connect mggraph, you give it your client ID, that's the application ID that we saw from Azure Active Directory, your tenant ID, because you always need to specify your tenant ID, and in my case, and in my demonstration, I'm using a certificate, so the certificate name or the certificate thumbprint. And I know using a thumbprint is not best practice, but yeah, you can use both if you want. And if you're ever inside Microsoft Graph and you want to know, okay, which permissions are actually granted to me, which context, which information am I connected with, you can always do get mg context, and then you can get that information. Okay, enough for the slides. Let's look at actual PowerShell. That's what you all have been waiting for. No, not Teams. All right. I hope that is, well, the colors will do, hopefully. All right, so I'm just going to show you a few things. I know I have the Microsoft Graph. Yes, Copilot went out, went GA, I know that. And no, I don't want to install a new version of PowerShell during my demo. No, thank you. All right, so I know I have already the Microsoft Graph modules installed, so we'll skip this. And then this is what I was talking about earlier. If you want to work with a list of users, and if you want to connect to the Microsoft Graph, you just need these two modules. So you can safely execute that. But in org, the alternative is to import everything, that's something you can do. You can also get a list of the different modules that are available. It's a long list. See, so you've got, these are all the modules that will get installed when you install module Microsoft Graph. It's files, financials, groups, devices, users, teams. There's a lot. So it's, be careful there. And only import what you need. I'm going to perform some operations in my demonstration that need the beta endpoint, so I'm going to select a beta profile. And my application has already been configured for certain permissions, but if you want to go the other way, you can also create a variable like this and specify all the permissions that your application wants to use. That's something you can do. The downside of this, of course, is that something has to be approved, right? Because otherwise you can ask for everything that you want. That's not what we want. But in this case, I'm not going to use that because my application has all the necessary permissions baked in. And then the actual authentication, and yes, I'm using a thumbprint. Don't tell anyone. I've got a certificate thumbprint, a client ID, and a tenant ID. I put that into my variable, and then I connect to the Microsoft Graph with that information. Right, and with a little bit of luck, that also will work. Welcome to the Microsoft Graph. That's what we wanted to see. And for one reason or another, my console is doing strange things today, but I'm sure you can relate. All right, some basic examples of operations. Now that we are actually connected to the Microsoft Graph, get mg user, and then we can go the traditional PowerShell way of selecting stuff for our output. We've got display names and user principal names. That's not rocket science, okay? I'm sure we all agree. Same for give me all my devices. And I've got a few servers integrated in my Active Directory, stuff like that. So everything you could expect from these basic commands. If you're ever, because I didn't specify my scopes, so the security context, if you're ever in doubt on which scopes you have and which scopes have been granted to your application, you can go to your context and ask for the scopes. and then we can see that we have these scopes or these permissions available to us to work with. And one of these is using Microsoft Teams and Microsoft and users. Some other small examples. We can get the latest Microsoft security alert in our tenant if we have any. Yes, we have a warning about Microsoft Defender ATP, see, security alert, stuff like that. So the possibilities are endless. It's not just interacting with teams or users or groups. It's much, much, much more. You can get to your Microsoft Secure Score if you want, etc. Get a list of users, something you can also do. And then you can also get a reference to something specific, in this case, one specific user, and then you can use OData filters. It's a little bit intimidating in the beginning when you get started with OData filters, but the syntax is not that hard. For example, we do a get mg user, and we want to filter display name equals myself. Let's execute that. And then we'll see. And I don't know what I'm doing wrong today in my console, but maybe something changed. And then you've got that user object with certain properties. All right. You can do the same thing to get a reference to a certain Microsoft team. So we are getting all the teams that this user is part of, and I'm filtering in, not in the traditional PowerShell way now. You can do both ways. I'm getting a list of all the teams that my user has joined, but I only want this PSConfEU team. My problem with PSConf is actually the name, because I'm coming from the SharePoint world. Again, sorry. And whenever I want to pronounce the word PSConfEU, I have the tendency to say PSConfig. PSConfig is a wizard on long forgotten times in SharePoint. So every time I have to stop myself while pronouncing PSConfEU, that's problematic. But yeah, blame SharePoint, like we like to do. Right. We're now inside of a team. Let's look at the information about the team. Again, some basic properties. And what we want to do now is get a reference to a specific channel within the team. I can show you the team to see that I'm not lying. And later on, we're also going to create a Microsoft team with lots more, much more than just one single commandlet. So I've got a team, PSConfEU, with a bunch of channels, and one of these channels is logistics. And in my code, I'm going to get a reference to that logistics channel and do something with it. So we get our channel. Again, we use a filter where the display name equals logistics. We get a reference to that channel. And then we're going to update our channel description. Welcome to Vienna. That's the description we want to use. And with update mg team channel, and the problem with the Microsoft Graph is that these commandlets can become very, very, very long, even longer than the Exchange ones that I used to use in the time. So there are quite some interesting ones there. Something else, a few other examples, is we can add an owner to a Microsoft team, for example. We have the owner, we get the owner's ID, and then you have to use this specific syntax, like this, and you don't have to craft that by hand. It's all very nicely documented in the Microsoft documentation. And basically, this is the template to create a new owner inside of Teams, and believe me, the user is not an owner yet. We execute this code, and the user will also be an owner now. In the interest of time, we're not going to go there. You can do stuff like archiving Microsoft Teams, invoke mg archive team, and then the team will be archived, so that means it's hidden in your list. You can also, of course, create new teams. You can do that the simple way or the relatively simple way. So you need some we usually call them teams creation arguments, but it's just a variable name. And then you specify a few basic characteristics of the team. You want the templates, because every team has a template that can be an empty template, which is called standard. There are a few other templates available to you. A display name of the tenant, and then the owner. And in this case, that's a user ID of the owner that I want to connect to my team. And then you go new mg team with these arguments. This is a simple example. You can go wild if you want. This is another example for a team that we're a sample engineering team with a description, with some pre-baked channels, even with these emojis included if you want that. and all the different possibilities that you can set inside of Microsoft Teams. So that might be Teams settings, that might be channel settings, that might be things more related to governance, for example. So you can all do this, and it's a very long list, right? You can specify permissions, the permissions that your external users can do in the team. Basically, everything that you configure within the Teams context, in the Teams settings, can be configured while provisioning or updated while provisioning a team. And then you do exactly the same thing. We create a new team with all these arguments. I'm not going to do that right now, because you will be waiting for 5 minutes. But believe me, that works. And then finally, don't forget to disconnect from the Microsoft Graph. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so I was not able to show you everything. But it's quite powerful, and I really like it a lot. So some takeaways: the Microsoft Graph. Don't get it wrong. It's not just for developers, but make sure you understand authentication, authorization basics. So creating your Azure AD application, fiddling around with the API permissions, finding the right API permissions in the documentation. Definitely go to the Microsoft Graph Explorer, and yeah, exactly, the documentation is really good, and you will need it. Finally, the Microsoft Graph changes all the time. So as many capabilities there are in Microsoft 365 and related technologies, the Microsoft Graph tries to keep up with all these changes, because every time there's a new feature, you need something new in the API, and that's why we have an API change log, which is updated frequently, every week usually. The problem is that the PowerShell commandlets take a little longer to become available. That's a downside. All right, so then I want to thank you for your attention to this brief overview of the Microsoft Graph and how you can interact with PowerShell. I'll be around for the rest of the conference, so if you've got any additional questions, you can ask them now, or hit me up there somewhere in the hallway, and then we'll talk about it. Thank you very much.